What's going on, guys? Welcome to today's video. We are actually going to be retiring this camera, the EOS R. It might be used a little bit going forwards on the channel, most likely not, because today we're testing out a new camera that I recently picked up. I suppose it's not a new camera since it's a 2019 body, but this is the Fuji XT3. And today we're going to be using the Viltrox Speedbooster, really seeing what this piece of gear has to offer and if it's a viable option for content creators, videographers, and filmmakers to use for professional use and even just for fun if you want to make YouTube videos. We'll also be doing some photograph tests because I did see some discrepancies between the video AF and the photo AF. Maybe that's something to do with the Fuji camera, or maybe it's just something to do with the Viltrox Speedbooster, but we're going to be using just one lens today. I do own a second lens. I own the Canon 100mm f2.8 macro L lens, and that was giving me a lot of problems with autofocus. Maybe it's because it's a macro lens, or maybe it's just because the lens itself is very old and the electronics in it, the autofocus might not be supported by the Speedbooster, but the autofocus was just going crazy, absolutely insane, not usable to any degree. And yeah, so first off, before we get started, if you don't know what a Speedbooster is, I'm going to explain it to you really quick. There are so many kinds of different cameras. I'm not going to explain every type of camera, but for speed boosters, they work on crop censored cameras. And that means that the sensor crops in a little bit to give and deliver its image. And so the Fujifilm XT3 has a crop factor of 1.5. So any lens that you choose to use, whether it's a crop sensor lens or not, regardless of what kind of lens it is, it's going to be a 1.5 times crop. So then you have to factor in the focal length, and then you're going to also multiply the aperture of the lens. So we're shooting at f2, but since I'm using the Speedbooster, this doesn't apply. And that is where the Speedbooster comes in. It's a focal length reducer, and so it takes your camera's crop factor and it almost fully negates it. So it's like a demagnifying glass of some sort. It's kind of witchcraft. I don't fully understand it. Well, I don't understand it even in like the slightest of ways. But basically it takes our 1.5 crop and brings it down to 1.0 something. So it's very close to being a full frame camera, a full frame image. And for most speed boosters, I would say 99% of the speed boosters out there, apart from the Metabones EF to RF speed booster, autofocus is just not usable when you put on a speed booster with your Canon EF lens. With that in mind, I was really curious about whether or not the autofocus would be usable with this, especially when you're going from one camera / lens manufacturer to another one and using a speed booster to use both in one kind of setup. A lot of times the electronics in the EF lens doesn't communicate well with other camera bodies, and that makes total sense. But recently, there have been some updates, some firmware updates for the Viltrox Speedbooster, the Fuji one in specific, to make autofocus much more consistent and much more usable. And I hope that you can see that now because we're shooting on the XT3, and hopefully I haven't been out of focus for like too much of this video so far. When I first bought the XT3 and the Speedbooster, I was very nervous because the autofocus was absolutely ratchet horrible. But then I looked, and I just want to remind you guys that firmware is absolutely incredibly important. And I looked, and my camera, the Fuji X-T3, was on firmware version 1.0. And the Speedbooster was on version, I think 1.7. And for the Fuji X-T3, currently we're on like 3.3, version 3.3, as opposed to being on 1.0. And then for the Speedbooster, we're on version 2.29 as opposed to 1.7. So I just made sure to update both of those. And if you're having some performance problems with autofocus or not seeing certain settings that you feel like you should be in your XT3, just make sure your firmware is up to date on both products, because yes, you do need to update the firmware on the Speedbooster, which is kind of weird and it's kind of confusing how to do it. But if you look it up on YouTube, there are some simple and easy tutorials showing you guys how to do that. But that's going to really ensure that you have really reliable autofocus. And when I made the updates to both of the camera and the Speedbooster, I was blown away at how there was a world of difference of how well the autofocus performed. Eye tracking was super consistent, really reliable, and it was very responsive. And then even without using face or eye tracking, just using various things in the foreground, at the background, and just moving the camera from one to the other to the next, to down, to up, to low, going forward, pushing in, pulling out. The focus was very impressive, very responsive. And one thing that I have heard a lot of people complain with using Fuji lenses is that you have to use new ones, because the newer ones are more suited for video shooting, videographers. And the older lenses that Fuji has, even the ones for like their X mount, aren't really geared towards being excellent in the autofocus department. And that is something that concerned me about switching over to Fuji. So with the benefits of using a speed booster, you get full frame, almost full frame field of view, which allows you to get some great shallow depth of field and really stop down your aperture. But also in that sense, you can take advantage of some of Canon and other third-party manufacturers like Tamron, like Sigma, those lens makers, newer styled lenses that have very fast autofocus, that have really well researched and developed electronics in them. And that way you can still take advantage of that fast Fuji autofocus, especially with the firmware updates that Fuji has been working on. For this video, for all the test footage that we're going to be showing, I will be recording in a plethora of different frame rates and different recording file sizes, so using 4K and using 1080p. And so I feel like that the Speed Booster really unlocks a lot of the potential that this camera has, because you already have some incredible specs. You already have some amazing capabilities within the XT3, being able to shoot 4K at 60 frames per second, DCI at 10-bit internal. It just absolutely blows my mind. And right now we're shooting in 1080p, but at 10-bit internal. If you're thinking about getting the XT3 with the Speed Booster, don't try it on the Canon 100mm 2.8 macro lens. If you do though, and you figure it out, let me know in the comment section below what I'm doing wrong, because I've looked it up. There's no information about that on the internet whatsoever, and I'm just kind of confused, so I just have to sell the lens, unfortunately. So I guess in my mind, it could be one of three issues. It could be that the electronics are old, and that's why the autofocus is just crap in that lens, in the 100mm. It could be that it's a macro lens and the Fuji X-T3 isn't able to tell which focus mode that the lens is in, so it doesn't know where to focus. And three, it could also just be that telephoto lenses and autofocus don't play well together with the Fuji X-T3, but I don't know if that's the scenario, because shooting on the 70mm, we certainly didn't run into any problems at all. So, and that is semi-telephoto. It's kind of just breaking into the range of where telephoto starts. But if you guys know anything about like why this was happening with the 100mm, I'd love to know. So feel free to toss that in the comment section below. But it's fine, you know. Sometimes you just have to do trial and error, and that's why I'm trying to make these videos for you guys, to kind of prevent you from having to go out and just buy a lens to see if it'll work with this kind of Frankenstein setup of the Fuji X-T3 or a Fuji X-mount camera using the Speed Booster with it. Wow, so ultimately I was really shocked with how this just turned out using the Speed Booster and using my 24-70 with image stabilization, or the VC. Super impressed. I'm gonna be making a Fuji X-T3 in 2020, or versus the X-T4, even though I don't have the X-T4. I'm gonna be making a video on that pretty shortly here, because this is an incredible camera and I've really loved and had a pleasure working with it thus far. All right, so I'm filming this almost like a week after the other segments were filmed, and I recently did my very first wedding film ever, and I had the choice to either bring with me my full frame lenses and use the Speedbooster. Wait, I gotta sneeze. Oh man, I'm sure the audio just peaked like crazy. Or I could use the Fuji lenses that I had purchased, built specifically for the X mount, which were the Fuji 35mm f2, and then the Viltrox 85mm f1.8. And so my conclusion on trying to rig out the XT3 as a full frame camera is this. If you rely on autofocus as one of the main things you're going to be needing on a shoot or in your videos, if you're just doing lifestyle type of YouTube things, I would say that maybe this isn't a reliable option for you. It's not probably something you should be depending on because it has usable autofocus, but it doesn't have reliable autofocus that you can really trust on to nail every time. I mean, you still get the eye box, you still get the face box, but it's just not quite as responsive as even when I updated the firmware and changed the settings to be super responsive and super fast to switch targets. It just wasn't very reliable, and it hunted a lot for focus, so you kind of got that pumping effect of focusing in and out on a subject. And so that's kind of why I've decided, for me as a wedding videographer, when I have my camera on the gimbal and when I need to kind of depend on autofocus as I'm pushing in or as I'm pulling out, I mean, I guess when I'm going side to side and walking laterally, I can depend on manual focus because it's not going to be going forward or backward. But for those few instances that I do really need to trust my autofocus system, I think that makes having some Fuji lenses to be much more valuable. And I guess my only gripe with that would be, you know, you're losing light because it's APS-C and you get that 1.5x crop. However, if you get fast primes to use for those instances where you really do need subject separation from the background, or when you're in a darker setting like a wedding reception, then that is certainly worth having, in addition to having kind of standard zooms like the 18 to 55 kit lens that Fuji provides, which is an f2.8 to f4 lens. That's a stunning lens, and so that's one that I'm picking up in the near future, and I might have to do some tests with that as well. But I think for me, the answer is going to be not to have full frame and to kind of ditch that, to say goodbye to that. I've only been on full frame for a few months, starting with the EOS RP and then moving up to the EOS R as my main full frame camera. And that has been a pleasure. It's been fun shooting full frame. However, I never had full frame 4K as an option, and with the Fuji XT3, even with the crop lenses on the camera without using the Speedbooster, I still get a wider field of view and a shallower depth of field using the XT3 as opposed to being in 4K on the EOS R or the RP. So for me, this camera is the logical answer, and I guess I am kind of concerned about the EOS R6 and R5 coming out, especially with the more affordable R6 and the incredible specs that camera is rumored to have. That certainly could be, I guess, a weakness that I might have, and I might want to jump ship from camera manufacturers again. However, I don't think that will be the case because there's just so many things that lie within the Fuji system, like in the settings, that I've really actually found to enjoy. Like, there's so much customization that you can really focus on. And even though it's not as user-friendly as Canon's UI and their settings menu, I think it's more suited for people who are intermediate to professional level, where you need to dial in every setting just the way you want it, and you need to be knowledgeable of what you're dialing in, why you're doing it, and how it's going to affect your image in the end. So I think that, I mean, I don't want to brag, I don't want to be like, oh, I know this does that, and I know how to make the perfect image, you know, but it's all subjective, and I'm glad that I at least have the options that I do within using Fuji cameras, because there's a lot of flexibility there to really customize what you're getting out of the camera. And with the XT4, and even in the future, like XT5, XT6, those cameras that will most likely be coming out, I think that this is a safe way to go, especially for wedding videographers, since Fuji has proven I guess in the past recent years, that they're getting serious about catering to videographers, catering to more professional shooters who need some more demanding specs out of their cameras. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I apologize for not uploading sooner. It's been like 2 weeks, I think, or maybe a week and a half, I'm not sure. I've been super busy, had my first wedding. I have a full-time internship with Pulse Movement, making content for them to spread the good word of God's love. But hopefully I can get my upload schedule back on track. I'm thinking over the weekend is when I will be uploading, probably on Sundays. And so we'll definitely see you guys next week. Make sure to check out my Patreon page if you're interested in supporting me and what I do on this channel and what I do for a living now, which is videography and photography. Check out my website. I just finished developing my website. That link will be in the description below, and there's still a few changes that need to be made, but I'm super excited to share this with you guys. It's been a long time in the works, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.